Okay, I really wish you hadn't said I was a great Bible scholar. That kind of floors me. But I'd first like to say that everything I'm going to say today, there were several commentaries we could use, several books, and I got things from all of them. So I'm very glad I'm not writing this like an essay for Miss Haggard, because I would hate to footnote everything that I got. So anything that I say is not my own words. It's someone who was very knowledgeable, who knew what they were talking about. And I do have a few of my own thoughts thrown in, so that will be obvious, but everything I say that sounds like a fact, I got from someone else, so that's my disclaimer. And I do appreciate getting a chair, because I have a fear of locking my knees from fear and falling over in a faint in front of y'all. So, I'll start out. And I do want to say, I hate it when I say I'll teach, because I get so nervous preparing, but I learn so much. And I think each of you that teach, you think that when you do it, you learn so much about it. And I'm very appreciative of that, and I hope you get a little bit of what I've learned through this. But my mother was a great talker, a big talker, and she had some favorite stories that she would share over and over and over. So I'm not sure if I really remember this, or if it's what I remember because I heard it so often. But you know how when you went to elementary school, they would send you every year to the nurse to check your eyes and your ears. And every year I would get the note saying, Brenda needs to go get her eyes checked. And every year I would take that note and throw it in the trash can, because I did not want to go get glasses. So, but in third grade, my friend took me went to my mother's car when she picked me up and said, Brenda got a note from the doctor. And I was like, oh, this is it. So I went to the eye doctor, and he told me, I'm going to turn this machine on, and it will project some letters on the back of the wall, and you're going to read these letters to me. So I was a very obedient child, and I started reading letters. And he laughed and said, I haven't turned the machine on. And my mother said, can you believe this girl reads a book constantly? And she said, yes, because she can't see anything further than the book in front of her face. And this is what I feel like I remember when I later got my glasses on. I went, because I could see everything so clearly that I hadn't been able to see. And every year after that, I would go to the doctor, and my eyesight would get a little worse and a little worse and a little worse. And I was extremely nearsighted. But I could see because I had glasses or contacts. But fast forward to 2015, I couldn't see out of my right eye suddenly. And I had actually gotten a virus in my right eye, which had harmed my cornea. And I needed a cornea transplant, which is not a big deal. It's a really common surgery. People routinely donate their corneas, which you might want to plan to do when you pass away. And there's only 1 in 10 people who have problems. Well, I turned out to be that 1 in 10. And I'll try to make this a quick story, but for about 3 years, I had really, really limited eyesight in my right eye, because instead of adhering flat to my eye, my cornea was very puckered. And I had my stitches in my eye for over 2 years. The doctor went in while I was away, and I could see this scalpel-looking thing coming toward my eye, and he cut it again, trying to get it to flatten out. Because if your cornea is puckered, it creates a very, very strong astigmatism. And the astigmatism wouldn't go away. So I still had my extreme nearsightedness, but now I had a very, very, very bad astigmatism. And no matter how strong they made my glasses, even with glasses on, I could not even see the big E on the eye chart. So I was not blind, but I was legally blind in my right eye. And, you know, when you can see well out of one eye and you can't see out of one eye, things are blurry. You know, it's never perfect. But after about 3 years, my eye had healed well enough that I could get a special contact, which I call my super contact. And I do remember this, the day I put it in, it was like a miracle to me. And I know it didn't fit the miracle definition we've talked about, but I could see the leaves on the trees, I could see the blades of grass, and it was like God had healed my eye. And then I got a cataract, because you have to use the eye drops very often, and it creates cataracts. So then I was hoping they could put the lens in, it would heal everything, but they can't do that with my astigmatism, it's so great. So then for about 6 months I couldn't wear the contact, and I was back to not being able to really see out of that eye. But then my eye healed and I got to put in my super contact again. And now, when Rhonda is driving, I can read the signs to her and she can't see it distance, but I can. So I have about 20, sometimes they can test me at 20/10 vision actually at distance. Now up close, I'll probably have to be putting on my reading glasses. But I feel very, very strongly for these people who were blind in the Bible. I was never blind. I could always see light and shapes. But just that little bit of eye problem, which was tiny compared to people who are truly blind, I feel for those people. If you are truly blind, even today, your life is so much more limited than people with their sight. And in the Bible times, I can't imagine what they went through. I really can't. And now we're hearing aids, and I can't smell much since COVID. But I would gladly give up all. I mean, I'm not saying this to make you feel sorry for me. I would give up every sense I have to keep my sight. That is just how I feel. I want to be able to see. So when I was given the choice of what I wanted to teach on, I jumped for God. Jesus heals the blind. So that is my long introduction. I promise I'm going on. But I really feel for these people. I can't imagine how much they desperately wanted to be healed. Desperately. So here we go. Okay. Even today, there's a very high incidence of blindness in the Middle East because, when you go and they dilate your eyes and everything, bright sunlight really is harmful to your eyes if you have any trouble. The sand aggravates the problems, and you may have seen these pictures in magazines where, the stuff coming out of your eyes, flies are really attracted to it. So back then, it was probably even worse. And blindness was one of the most difficult things to heal. And in John, it even says, no one has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. I had never really thought about this, but there are miracles in the Old Testament, like when the oil kept going day after day. But there is no incidence of a man or any person being healed of blindness in the Old Testament. Jesus is the only one who ever healed a blind person. And there are more stories of a blind being healed than any other incidence of a physical ailment. And Jesus healed the blind probably numerous times, but there are 7 instances recorded. And 2 of these were within a group of other people besides blind being healed. Like in 7:21, it says, in that hour he healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight. So we don't even know how many people he healed. But it does talk about 2 blind men in Matthew, a blind mute demoniac, which I can't even imagine that poor man, in Matthew and Luke. And then the 3 we're going to talk about in detail today are Bartimaeus, the blind man at Bethsaida, and the man born blind in John 9. And first we're going to read about Bartimaeus, which is from Mark 10:46 through 52, and I'm going to have people read for me so my voice doesn't go out, and Rhonda's going to read this.
Okay. This is blind Bartimaeus, Mark 10:46. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called to the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. Immediately, he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road.
Thank you. Okay, in each of these 3 healings we're going to talk about have something unusual about them too. Also, in this case, Matthew reports about it, but he says there were 2 blind men healed at the same time. Mark and Luke focus on just one, and only Mark names the man. His means of healing is he just spoke it, and Jesus healed him. It was through his faith. What is unusual about this is that Bartimaeus is actually named. I had never really considered this, but the only other person I can think of that was named who was healed is Lazarus, when he was raised from the dead. But he was really talked about quite a bit. He was part of the story of Jesus before he was healed. And the commentators speculate on why he's named. We can't decide if this is true until I guess we meet him in heaven. But they theorize is that it was such a miracle that it really changed his life, which I would easily believe, and that he became a person who spread the news of Jesus, and it was such an impact on that area that he became a well-known man, and that may have been why they named him. We won't know about that. It appears that he came alone. It doesn't say that friends brought him, and it was through his blind faith and his own initiative that he called out to Jesus. And if you noticed, people were even saying, be quiet, don't bother him, keep to yourself. So he didn't have friends to help him. And if you think about him coming on a crowded street by himself, that really took a lot of initiative and faith for him to do that by himself. And an interesting detail is that he threw his cloak aside. And many people have wondered about that. Why was that included? Because you think probably nothing in the Bible is just there for no reason. And I had never even really noticed that detail because, you hear the miracles so often and we've heard them and we just accept them that I never considered that. But in the Roman government, sometimes we see people beside the side of the road asking for money, and I have to admit, sometimes I question their need or what they're going to do with the money. But if you wanted to become a beggar in Roman days, you could actually go to the government and prove that you were needy. I'm blind, I have no other means of support, and prove yourself. And they would give you a special cloak that indicated you actually needed to beg. It proved that you were legitimate, that you legitimately needed to beg. So when he threw down that cloak, it could have been that type of cloak, we don't know. He was actually giving up his means of support. Because someone could have easily stolen that cloak, he had no way of knowing, he couldn't see it. And in a crowded place, I would assume people would really want that when he went up to Jesus. So it really shows his faith. Another, idea that people have given out, and I've really never heard this, but it was kind of a type of language where when you throw down your cloak, it shows your intention of following someone, like he threw down his cloak to follow Jesus. And then another thing to think about is on Jesus' triumphal entry, the last time he came to Jerusalem, remember people were throwing their cloaks down before Jesus and the palm branches, and that was a sign of servitude. So he was showing his servitude before Jesus. So those are some theories about why Mark included that he threw his cloak aside. And the next one we're going to read about is the blind man in Bethsaida, and that is from Mark 8:22 through 26. Sorry.
Still me. Okay. Again, Mark 8:22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village."
Thank you. Sorry, you weren't ready. Okay. Okay. If you notice this one, some people did bring him to Jesus, so he was not alone. His means of healing is first Jesus spit on his hands and then put his hands on him. So he didn't just speak it, he also touched him. This is a very unusual miracle, which I had never thought about, but it's the only recorded gradual or two-stage miracle. Jesus first puts his hands on his eyes and spit, and the man only partially sees. Then Jesus touches him again, and he can see clearly. The only thing I'd ever thought about before when I read this miracle is it's kind of strange that he said, I see men walking like that, like he's walking. But you know, first he hadn't been able to see anything. Jesus touches him, he sees not really well. Then he touches him again and he sees clearly. Every other miracle that's recorded, Jesus heals him in one clear time. So that is very unusual. And now, you know, I can understand that he could see, you know, fuzzy, because I could see you saying, well, I see people, but they don't look exactly right. I mean, I understand seeing like that. So I had never really thought about it, that Jesus partially healed him and then totally healed him. And that is very unusual. So why do they think this happened? Again, this is a theory. But right before this, in Mark 8, before this chapter, it talked about the feeding of the 4,000, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Then the Pharisees came and argued with Jesus. Jesus and the disciples got into the boat, and he warned them about the Pharisees. And he said, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And throughout the Bible, leaven is used to represent sin. But the disciples thought that he was actually warning them about the bread of the Pharisees. And he said, having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And the commentaries think that Jesus healed this man in 2 stages to show that you can see, but you don't always see spiritually. So at first, this man was unable to see at all. Then he could see, but not see clearly. And then he could see clearly. So the disciples, let me read this exactly right. The disciples could see, but they weren't able to understand about the Pharisees and the yeast. They didn't understand what Jesus was saying. And I really hope that Jesus described this in detail to them later, because I'm not sure I would have gotten that from this miracle. It kind of makes sense now, but it's a stretch. So we're supposed to grow in our ability to see. Our faith needs to mature as we grow so that we see and understand. So, we need to have eyes and still see spiritually as well. So that's everyone I read from really remarked on that miracle, but it was so unusual, and I had never considered that at all. So now we're going to read about the man who was blind from birth. This is from John 9. It's actually the whole chapter of John, but we're only going to read, I think, the first 12 verses, and this is Mrs. Haggard.
Jesus heals a blind man that was born blind. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in this world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, No, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then have you opened your eyes? They asked. He replied, The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said.
Thank you. Okay. This man was healed by Jesus spitting on the ground, making mud, putting it on his eyes, and then the man had to go wash in the pool. And at first, this sounds like a 2-part miracle, because there are 2 parts that the man had to do, but he wasn't healed in 2 parts. He wasn't partially healed at first, and then totally healed when he washed. He just had to do 2 things. Y'all see the difference. It is unusual because it's the only place in the gospel where it's specifically said that the man was afflicted from birth. There are probably many instances where the person who was healed was afflicted from birth, but it doesn't state that. In Acts, it is mentioned twice that there were people who were helpless from birth, but not in the gospel. This man does appear to be fairly well known because the disciples knew that he had been afflicted from birth. So either he was well known in the community or well known in their circle. And we kind of wonder, why does Jesus spit often? He spit in the one before this, on this one. He also healed a deaf stammerer in Mark 7:33 by spitting. It was actually very common in this time for people to believe they could be healed through spit. The Romans especially used it if it was the spit of a famous person. They would try to use it to heal themselves. Yeah. The Romans used it they thought to heal snake bite, epilepsy, eye problems, cancer, and they would use it to avert the evil eye. Now Jesus' spit was obviously different, I would say that, but he was a wise physician, and he probably wanted to use the customs of the day, knowing that that's what the person expected to be healed by. That's what they used, and it probably made the person feel more confident and at ease if he used something they were familiar with. Also, when he asked him to wash in the pool of Siloam, that was a very well-known pool. It was called sent because water was sent to it from these aqueducts that were built in the time of King Hezekiah, so they had been around for a long time. It was very well known. And he sent the man to the sent pool, and then Jesus was also sent from God, so it was kind of a play on words. Also, it's an important miracle because it connects sin to suffering. And you notice they said, did this man, was he blind because his parents sinned, or did he sin before birth? We rarely think a baby is born with problems because he sinned or his parents sinned. But it was a really common thing in that day. And a lot of the Jewish people believed that, that babies were born because they had sinned before birth. There is a writing that exists from Judah, the patriarch, where he discusses this topic about, did babies sin in the embryo or do they sin at birth? And he said he thought if children were sinning in the embryo, they would either even kick so hard that they would kick their way out if they were sinning. So he decided that it probably begins at birth. And he used this, based it on Genesis 4:7. Sin is knocking at the door to mean the minute they're born, they begin sinning because sin is knocking at the door. But a lot of Jews did believe you could sin before birth. Also, the Roman world, the Greek world was really prevalent. They really looked to the Greeks for a lot of their beliefs. And all of the Greeks believed that all souls existed before birth. And they either lived in the Garden of Eden, which I thought was interesting because I didn't know that the Greeks believed in the Garden of Eden, or the seventh heaven, or a certain chamber where you just waited to be born. And however you acted prior to birth was how you were at birth. If you sinned, you were good at birth. If you sinned, you were bad at birth. If you didn't sin, you were good at birth. But also, this is, pretty common in the Old Testament that the sins of the father goes on to the child. And this is just one place it said, is in Psalm 109:14. May the iniquity of his father be remembered before the Lord, and do not let the sin of his mother be blotted out. So it was a typical idea of the time. And even though we say we don't believe this today, a lot of times when a tragedy happens to a family, people say things where you almost subconsciously people are blaming that person for the tragedy. You're thinking, what did they do that this is happening? What did they do that this family is so hurt by so many things? So I think it's just human nature to learn to ask why things happen. And the obvious answer is they deserve it. So I think although we think we're way beyond this, we're probably not as far beyond it as we think we are. But Jesus did not connect this man's suffering with his sin. He said the affliction gave Jesus the opportunity to show what God can do. And the other gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, always show that the miracles that were done were to connect, to show Jesus' overwhelming compassion. And when I think about the blind men or people in the Bible, I do feel great compassion for them. I think their lives were so hard. But what I feel for them is just a tiny, tiny thing of what Jesus probably felt for them. You know, he understood their feelings, he knew their every thought, and he must have just cried out and wanted to heal as many people as he could. And I could see that they would show that compassion in those Gospels. But in John, he always called the miracles signs, and they always were done to show the power of God. So it was a totally different reason in John. And this miracle may be the best documented miracle because it was intensely investigated by the Pharisees. They questioned this man, they questioned his parents, and then they questioned the man again. And the first questions they asked the man is, well, why did Jesus heal you on the Sabbath? And I think it's been interesting when I've heard about the other miracles, there were a lot of them done on the Sabbath. And I wonder if it was just to stir things up, or I don't know, did it just happen that way? But a lot of them were done on the Sabbath. And then they said, well, how could a sinful man even do this thing? And the man basically said, well, he must be a prophet. Then they questioned his parents, and they basically just passed it back to the man. He said, he's of age, ask him, leave us out of it. And then they asked the man again and said, well, you need to give honor to God, not Jesus. And the man said, well, Jesus is the one who healed me, and if this man were not of God, he could do nothing. And what I think is really sad about the story is first he was blamed for being blind, and then he was also blamed for being healed, because the Pharisees became so angry that they kicked him out of the synagogue. But Jesus went and found him and said, I am the Son of God, and the man ended up believing in Jesus. So he not only progressed from physical blindness to physical healing, but he progressed in his spiritual healing. First, he saw Jesus as a man, then a prophet, and then he finally worshiped him as the Son of Man, and he said, Lord, I believe. So he really grew in both ways. So we all, I would say everyone in here believes that Jesus can heal the blind. I don't think we have any trouble with that. But what else can we learn from the healing of the blind? Why do we still study these miracles? Well, I think, as I mentioned before, they do show Jesus as the compassionate God he is. And they also show God's infinite, complete power. He created us. There's no doubt in my mind he could heal whatever he wants to heal. But they also fulfill so many prophecies about Jesus as a healer of the blind. And I'm only going to read a few of these, but in Isaiah 42 it says, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. And again, that same chapter, Isaiah 42:16, I will lead the blind in a way that they do not know, in paths that they may not know, I will guide them. I will turn the darkness before them into light, the rough places into level ground. And then Psalm 146:18, or maybe 16, the Lord opens the eyes of the blind. So it was prophesied he would do this. And Jesus even said about himself that one of the prophecies he fulfilled is that he would heal the blind. And in Matthew 11, John the Baptist said that one of the reasons he knew Jesus was the Messiah is that he healed the blind. So there were a lot of prophecies fulfilled with that. Another reason we study it is that healing of the blind can be used as a metaphor for Jesus bringing light into a very dark world. And the chapter prior to the healing of the man who was born blind is the chapter where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And you know, in John, he really set up the book with a lot of symbolism, and he set it up very strategically. So he says, I'm the light of the world, and then he heals this man who was born blind. And the man goes from spiritual blindness to spiritual light. And John also said, whoever follows me will never, well, Jesus said, but John couldn't. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And then he gave that whole story about the man who was healed from blindness. In 1 John, it says, Jesus is the light, and in him is no darkness at all. And in Ephesians 5, it says that we are called the children of light. So it's also part of our job to bring light to other people. These miracles were also done because throughout the Bible, blindness is used as an analogy for people who are without God. If you're without God, you're blind. In Luke it says, "See to it then that the light within you is not darkness." And John says, "Then Jesus told them, you are going to have the light with you a little longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they are going." And John, "I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should remain in darkness." And then these miracles are used because physical blindness is always symbolic of spiritual blindness. In Matthew, Jesus called people blind guides, blind fools, blind men, and none of them were actually blind physically. In John 9:41, "Now that you can see, yet you still remain in your sin." And like I said, John uses things often very symbolically of people seeing but not understanding. Not just the one blind man's story, but think about the walk to Emmaus when the men were walking with Jesus and seeing him, but they didn't really see who he was until he was gone and wasn't with them. And then Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection, actually saw Jesus, but didn't realize who it was until he was gone. So they were seeing but not understanding. And that's kind of one of the themes of John throughout his gospel. And another reason to study of the healing of the blind is because we can be blind in many more ways than physical blindness. We can be blind to certain things. And these are the ones that are blind with a biblical basis. We can be blind to the simplicity of the gospel. And this is talked about in 2 Corinthians 4:4 and Matthew 5:15-14. And sometimes we can think the gospel has to be very complex. We have to work for it. It's based on works. And in reality, the gospel is based on our faith. We can be blind to our own spiritual immaturity. That's in 2 Peter 1:9. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We can be blind to the divine perspective. And that's hard for us because we're not God, but I think of it, and I'm not a crafty person in the least, but like a beautiful needlework or embroidery, you look at the back and it's knots and the thread is going all different ways, and it's so hard to see the pattern. And that's what I think of when I look at my life and I don't understand what God is doing, why these things are happening. I can't see what God is making in my life. But not only at the end of my life, but I can look back at things I didn't understand at the time. And I do see the picture. It's like when you turn over the needlework and you see, oh, what a beautiful pattern. I see what God did. I'm seeing the picture. And that's the difference to me between my perspective and God's perspective. We're looking at the knots and the crazy thread going every which way. We need to think, turn it over. It'll all make sense at the end. That's God's perspective. He sees the finished product. And that is hard for me because I'm not looking at God's perspective. And we can be blind to our own faults. Matthew 18 and Luke 6 talk about the speck in others' eyes while we don't notice the beam in our own eyes. So this made me think of things I can be blind to that aren't in the Bible. I can be blind to other people's problems. I can be blind to other ways to do things besides the way I've always done them. I get on that path and I do things the very same way all the time. I can be blind to other possibilities for my life except what I had planned on doing. I can be very blind to how my actions affect other people. I can often be blind to how blessed I am. I can even be blind to my answered prayers. I hate to admit this, but I can pray and pray for things, and I get it, and I forget to even remember and thank God for them. And I can be blind to areas God wants me to work in or things that God wants me to do. And we can be blinded by things, and these are things from the Bible. We can be blinded by money. I'm sure this is mentioned many other places, but Exodus, Deuteronomy, and 1 Samuel talk about that. We can be blinded by hate. That's in 1 John. We can be blinded by half-heartedness. That's in Revelation. And I thought about things I could be blinded by. I probably could have gone on forever, but I could be blinded by worry. I can be blinded by depression, by fear. I can be blinded by comparing my life to others. And that's a nice way to say I can be blinded by jealousy at times. I can be blinded by pain, either physical pain or emotional pain. I can be blinded by just being too busy to notice what I should notice. And I can be definitely blinded by preoccupation with myself. And, once I started thinking about this during the day, I think of a million things I'm blinded by or blinded to that God can really put into your mind. So there's been quite a bit of information about how Jesus healed the blind, what was unique about the healings, and how we can apply some of these lessons from spiritual blindness to our lives today. But being a teacher before, I thought, what is the main idea? What am I trying to get across here? What does God want me to really remember from this? So I looked and I found this verse, and I thought it really summed it up, and this is how I'm going to finally end this lesson today. It's Exodus 4:11. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Thank you.